Hi, Bill here. I'd like to show you some checkmate patterns involving the lone king. So I'm going to give Buck a king. I'm going to put the king on the edge of the board, which is where it gets mated in the endgame. I'm going to add a white king, put it on the strongest attacking square relative to here, which is here, because the king controls all three of these squares. So this king cannot move off the back rank. Now we can go through all the combinations of pieces. If I had a pawn, can't checkmate. A bishop, can't mate. A knight can't mate. If there was a pawn here, that would make a stalemate. Or if there was a bishop here, that's a stalemate, but there is no mate. If I had a rook, somewhere on the back rank, that will be mate. So that is one checkmate pattern with the rook. The other one is when the king's in the corner, and the king could also be facing it, which would be the same pattern, but the king could be a knight's move away, and that would be checkmate. If the king's on the side, not the corner, a knight's move away will not work because the king can slip out. So that's what happened there. Okay, so that's two mating patterns with king and rook against king. So all the other checkmates are those two basic patterns. Now, because a queen can do anything a rook can, of course this could always also be a queen. Okay, now, so that's it for single pieces. Now let's have all the other combinations, starting with the weakest. So if I had a pawn here, that makes a stalemate. If I had another pawn, so the pawn could be here, that's checkmate. So white could have moved the pawn down checkmate, or the pawn could have been over here, moved down checkmate. Now we had a bishop, a similar sort of thing. The bishop could have been there, and we had a white pawn, could move the pawn down, checkmate, or here, because a bishop controls all the squares that a pawn does. If you can checkmate with a pawn, you can also checkmate with a bishop. And another kind of checkmate pattern is where the bishop gives a check. So I'll move the bishop onto a white square where it gives check, put the pawn here, and that's a mate. So bishop and pawn against king. If I remove that bishop and instead place a knight, because the king's in stalemate, I can add a knight anywhere where a knight gives check, so it could be there or there, that would be a mate. And of course, because a rook can also mate, it's not very interesting to put it here, because that's also a mate without the pawn, but have it right next to the king, so it's guarded by the pawn, and that'd be arguably a new pattern. And it's not even worth looking at adding the queen to the pawn, because that would be overkill. Okay, so that's a pawn and a piece. Let's have a look at two pawns and say two minor pieces. So I'll remove that and remove that. Now again, if I had a bishop here, add a knight, because black king is stalemated. If I had a knight anywhere where it gives check, that will be a checkmate. Or yeah, we do it the other way around though. We can't set up a checkmate where the bishop's checking, because it's not possible for the knight cover both these. Or is it? Okay, so what I need to do is move the king out of opposition, put the knight here, and have a white squared bishop. Now the bishop can go in checkmate. So we can now checkmate with the bishop as well as the knight. Okay, now two bishops. If I remove the knight, we can have a checkmate, something like this. Checkmate. Okay, so that would be a checkmate if the king was in the corner. Go checkmate, something like this. So we've got checkmate with two bishops. Now, if you had a pure endgame king and two knights against king, it's only a draw with best play, but it is possible to set up a checkmate, though you cannot force it if the defender defends correctly. So the king in the corner, get rid of these bishops. I can add a knight so it gives check, and a knight can cover this square, so anywhere where the knight covers the b8 square is going to be checkmate. So that's checkmate in the corner. Now surprisingly enough, you can also checkmate on the side. So the king's on an edge square somewhere. Whoops, where's the king gone? The king's on an edge square, and we have a knight, say, checking the king, the other knight over here. So when you've got two knights like this, they form a square. So there's four squares controlled by knights which form a square. Put the king here or here, and now just get rid of those highlights. Now the king is in checkmate. So we've looked at two minor pieces against a king. Now once you start adding a rook, it's overkill because you've already got mate with king and rook against king. But there is one worth knowing. So we could have a knight here. Get rid of this knight. I'll move the king up to here, and we have a rook here, say. The rook can move in checkmate. That's a pattern worth knowing with the king, rook and knight against king. Okay, so I think that's about enough patterns with a king. So imagine now the king is too far away to help in the checkmates, and we can look at different piece combinations. I'll start with the king in the corner. It's going to be easy to checkmate here because the king only controls four squares. So only these four squares need to be controlled for checkmate. Okay, you can't do it with two pawns. You can't do it with a pawn and a piece. You can't do it with two minor pieces. You can do it with a rook and a knight. So I've put a knight here, and we have a rook somewhere. The rook can move in. Checkmate, a checkmate worth knowing, and by symmetry of the board it's really the same pattern. If the rook was there, that would also be checkmate. So that's one worth knowing. Okay, so rook and a bishop can't be done. You can checkmate with two rooks. So if I remove the knight, and I've got a rook somewhere, go down, check. This rook stops the king escaping the back line. This rook gives check. That's an important checkmate. It's also checkmate, of course, if the king's on the edge somewhere. Another one in the corner is one rook here, the other rook giving check down here, which is really the same pattern by symmetry. There's two other checkmates of interest. We can add a queen, but we won't have the queen give check. Now the king is in stalemate, so all I have to do is add a piece to check. A pawn won't do, so add a pawn there. The pawn blocks the queen, so the king could escape. However, add a bishop somewhere in this diagonal, except for this square. That is a checkmate. If I remove the bishop and add a knight here, that is a checkmate. If I remove the knight and add a rook, that is a checkmate. Put the king back on the side somewhere. That is a checkmate. And one of the most important checkmates is with the queen. When the king's on the edge, you have the queen directly in front. As long as this queen's guarded by something, anything, even just a pawn, there's no other black piece that can capture here. That will be a checkmate wherever the king is on the edge. And when the king's in the corner, you have an additional possibility. You can check the king from diagonally, and that's also a checkmate. And the other square is, if you attack diagonally when the king's on the edge, if this square is occupied or controlled by white, that will be a mate. Okay, so that's some checkmates with the queen. So another one is with the king on the edge. Is say a queen's here, and if we have a bishop somewhere, bishop can move in and give check. It's a bit like a scissor checkmate. The two diagonals cross each other. That's a checkmate there. So that's pretty much it for the important two-piece combinations. We'll have a look at some of the three-piece ones. Okay, so we could leave the bishop there. We could add, oops, could say a knight here, a rook here. So the rook and knight has stalemated the king. The king cannot move, so the bishop gives check. That's a mate. I could remove the bishop. I could add a pawn. Pawn gives a mate. I could remove the pawn and have a knight instead. That's a mate there with two knights against the king. And some other patterns are, if I remove these knights, I put a pawn here, and that controls these two squares, and a pawn either here or over here. If the rook goes down to the back, that's a back rank checkmate, because the king cannot move to the second rank. So these two pawns are good at controlling squares in a row. Now, there's some other back rank checkmates. If I were to remove this pawn, add, oops, square, all I need to do is control this. I could add a bishop to control that square, so that would be a mate. I could remove the bishop, and all I need to do is control this square. So anywhere where a knight controls this square will be mate. And knight could be lots of different places to create a mate. So we've got mates on the back rank. We've got yeah, so it's a number of three-piece combinations there. Another one is if move the knight, put a pawn here, remove the rook, have a pawn here, defend the other pawn. Whoops. I'm going to need to put the king in the corner. If I add a bishop, that's going to be mate. Okay, so that's probably most of the important ones for the three pieces against the king. Okay, we're going to have a look at some checkmate when the king's in the middle of the board. So the king's okay, so I'll just clear these. So the king's on any of these squares in this area. It's all pretty much the same. I'll put the king, say, there. If I have the king guarding these squares, so this rank, if I had a rook here and a rook on this rank, that will be a checkmate because the king cannot move to any of these ranks. Either of these rooks could be substituted by a queen, or I could have a queen on this rank. Sorry, queen on this rank. And that will be a checkmate. Okay, so that's some mating patterns with king in the centre. There's some rather fancy ones. Okay, so there's one where there's a rook here. There's a bishop on this diagonal. And there's a bishop here. So there's a very nice checkmate here where the bishop defends the rook by x-ray. The rook covers these squares, the bishop covers these squares. So it's a very nice scissor checkmate pattern. So we can have a look at a few more checkmates with the queen. Okay, so I'll move the king up a bit to make it a bit easier. Now if I add a queen here, yeah, as long as I've got the queen defended by something, all I have to do is cover these squares and be checkmate. I can do that by putting a bishop there, or so that's a checkmate. I can remove that. All I have to do is control these squares, so I can put a rook somewhere on this rank. There's a checkmate, or I can add a knight to cover these two squares, so there could be a knight there. I can even have checkmate with a pawn, but what I've got to do is switch these around. Then I add a pawn here to cover these two squares, and that is a checkmate. Okay, now we can look at checkmates where the queen is a diagonal, one square away diagonally from the king. So in these cases, what I have to do is control these two squares. So I could do it by adding, say, a bishop. There's a checkmate. Or I can add a knight to cover these two squares, so I could put the knight here. Or I could add a rook on this square. So again, the queen defends the rook by x-ray, and that is a checkmate. So that's a few more mating patterns with the king in the centre. And let's see, so we've looked at quite a few mating patterns against just the king by itself. So remember, in some cases these can just be fragments of a position, or they might be the complete position. Okay, so thank you for watching.